This is Duke University.
So welcome everyone. My name is Taro Choa. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, and it's my honor to chair today's first panel. We're going to have Svetlana Boym and Martin Land speaking in this first panel. We're going to start with Svetlana Boym, who is the Kurt Hugo Reisinger Professor of Slavic and Comparative Literatures at Harvard University and a faculty associate of the Graduate School of Design. Boym's primary areas of teaching and research are aesthetics and philosophy and literature, visual culture, and the urban imaginary. She's also a writer and practicing artist. Her projects include phantasmagoria and nostalgic technologies. She's the author of 4 books. In 2001, The Future of Nostalgia, 2008, Architecture and the Off-Modern, 2006, Territories of Terror, Memories and Mythologies of Gulag, also the author of a novel in 2003, Ninochka. And her most recent book is Another Freedom, The Alternative History of an Idea. Her talk today is entitled Off-Modern Jew, Estrangement and Nostalgia for the New World Culture. Please welcome me, and join me in welcoming Svetlana Boym. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I thought I would be in an eccentric position at this conference since I'm not technically a scholar of Jewish studies, but then I realized eccentricity here is the norm that hopefully stimulates productive dialogues. So I will try to propose an alternative genealogy of the contemporary Jewish thought, or hyphenated Jewish thought, or half-Jewish thought, which might help us estrange the discussion of the end of history by retracing some roads not taken. I will focus on the tradition which, after Hannah Arendt, we could call passionate thinking, and I understand it specifically as thinking not with passion or emotion, but thinking with political experience, rather than with ideology or a specific philosophical system of thought. So this particular kind of political passionate thinking opens up the questions of judgment and opens up into alternative Jewish cosmopolitan imagination. So in Tikkun Olam, with which Professor Ben Habib ended her very stimulating lecture. So on a very brief personal digression, having been a scholar of the 20th century and its many disasters and delusions, and having come from a family of survivors of Gulag and not survivors of Babi Yar, I became fascinated by thinkers and writers who, in most difficult circumstances of mid-20th century Europe, didn't get history tragically wrong. Maybe getting it completely right was not possible, but at least didn't get it tragically wrong. These are writers for whom we don't have to make excuses. Oh, well, he's been a little bit Stalinist. Okay, he was a little bit Nazi, and so on. So often my thinkers were lucid fellow travelers or dissenters who exercised difficult and improbable art of thinking with real political experience. And I really liked Jonathan Bayarin's formulation of thinking about Jewishness not only through loyalty, but also through literacy. And for me, it's also kind of a way of foregrounding Jewish literacy behind theories of estrangement that I've been always fascinated with. So often my writers were not systematic, but rather essayistic thinkers who thought through parables, paradoxes, the webs of stories, honest zigzags, to quote Osip Mandelstam, rather than through the Hegelian spirals, partaking but not belonging to various theoretical movements. So they didn't fall into more spectacular paradigms of familiar Jewish idealism, messianism, and we often lack vocabulary and frameworks to account for these forms of paradoxical but lucid thinking. So specifically, I took to heart your description of the conference and invitation to think about what theory was and what came to the end and what ends, or perhaps means, also are. So first I would rethink the very notion of linguistic turn. I would argue not with Jakobson but with Shklovsky and others that there might have been something else at stake. I would like to confront the concept of worldliness, specifically this kind of civic political worldliness, and the Jewish question. And also I will talk about what Shklovsky calls half-Jew. He calls himself half-Jew and a role player. And I was told it's politically incorrect to call my paper once half-Jew. This is Shklovsky's term. So, okay, this is the collapse of technology. This is the temporary. So I wanted also, since I wrote a lot about estrangement, this time I wanted to think about estrangement not as a negative identity, but of a certain form of Jewish culture and civic consciousness. So I would not be talking about Walter Benjamin. This is my only evocation of Walter Benjamin. And I was very impressed by the letter he wrote after his visit to Moscow, letter to Jules Arad. He claims that after his visit to Moscow, he can no longer do pure theory, because in Moscow, he writes, factuality is already theory, end of quote. It's a very mysterious quote. I understand factuality not as positive facts, but as certain forms of experience that his materialist method encouraged him to have, which allowed for more paradoxical and arguably more lucid conception of what was going on in Russia at that time. So my lecture would be a bit of a montage. I'll be running through various thinkers, but often I would be struggling through kind of oxymoronic vocabulary. I will talk about modernist humanism, vernacular cosmopolitanism, uncanny worldliness, engaged estrangement, brave fear, and so on. So I will start with Viktor Shklovsky and then talk briefly about Hannah Arendt and Osip Mandelstam. So to begin with, most of us have heard that postmodernism died quietly in its sleep sometime in the zero decade of the 21st century. So in my quest for a definition of the modern project, I wanted to get away from the endless ends of art history and the propositions post, neo, avant, and trans. So instead there is another option, not to be out, not to be in, but to be off, as an off-stage, off-key, off-beat, and occasionally off-color. So I proposed it as in a typical Russian fashion. Of course, I wrote a manifesto of the off-modern, which comes from this half-Jewish thought. So off-modern, in my definition, involves an exploration of side alleys, and lateral potentialities of the project of critical modernity. It has both spatial and temporal dimension. It might not be peripheral, but it's hardly superfluous vis-a-vis West European and American modernity. I even checked the etymology of off, and in fact, interestingly, it actually comes from of, which is a sign of belonging. So I'm trying to argue that in this off, it's a kind of mediation between estrangement and engagement, belonging and distancing. And I would try to develop the concept between Shklovsky and Hannah Arendt, what I call estrangement for the world. So this notion of off-modern, I will not go too much into it, was inspired by Viktor Shklovsky, who proposed a very interesting figure for the discussion of the evolution of thinking, for genealogy of thought. He proposed the figure of chess move in knight in the game of chess. So he believed that it's important to cheat the straight narrative of progress and explore third routes, the zigzags, the diagonals, the oblique moves, the movements of the chess knight. And Shklovsky wrote that the tortured road of the chess knight is a road of the brave. So it's not a practice of evasion, but a practice of what would be called honest zigzag. And I will try to explain what are the politics behind this oblique move. So I wanted to trace this kind of Shklovsky is best known for his concept of estrangement, estranение, defamiliarization. I wrote about it a lot. I will try to be brief because I want to relate it now to the Jewish identity and argue that estrangement or defamiliarization is not merely an aesthetic device, but also a certain practice of dissent and a certain transformation of self-conception of a Jewish right, or half-Jewish right. So it is little known, and I would argue that Shklovsky redefines his conception of estrangement after his participation in First World War, where he actually goes on the campaign with the Russian army through Persia, Turkey, Caucasus, and witnesses a lot of violence, and also after his experience in the October Revolution. So it is little known that the founder of the formalist theory had an adventurous, albeit brief, political career, and he wrote most of his text on the fronts of World War I. His love for poetry and poetics was hardly academic. He was severely wounded twice, had 17 pieces of shrapnel in his body, and supposedly he recited the avant-garde poetry of Vladimir Khlebnikov while being operated without anesthesia in the military hospital. So here is for you the practice of estrangement. Shklovsky embraced the revolutionary spirit, but he was welcomed February Revolution, was a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which advocated for the Constitutional Assembly that briefly existed after the storm of the Winter Palace. And Shklovsky, who was, as you can see, quite brave, he writes that the only time he cried is after the dissolution of the Constitutional Assembly with the help of Baltic sailors. So I think recovering this kind of history also opens up what's understood about left, and to make a corrective, majority of Russian Jews were actually not members of Bolshevik Party, but were constitutional Democrats, Mensheviks, Trotskyists, and so on and so forth. So after this experience, Shklovsky was a member of anti-Bolshevik underground briefly, and then he has to escape and travels through the ice of the Gulf of Finland to Germany, and that's there in Germany he writes his essay on the Knights, on the zigzag and the road of the brave. But now we see that some of his early assessment of the revolution was actually quite interesting and correct. So I want to revisit with this view his early essay, Art as a Technique, very briefly, remind you what estrangement means. This is our Shklovsky. So estrangement suggests distancing, dislocation, making strange. It also involves bringing forth a new beginning. I try to put together in my book Shklovsky's theory of estrangement and Hannah Arendt's conception of freedom as a new beginning. And Shklovsky's theory of estrangement, interestingly, would be used in 1960s during the writers' trials as a defense of the writers. So it actually had very explicit connection to the practices of dissent. So Shklovsky famously writes that we live in the era of routinization, habituation devours things, clothes, furniture, one's wife, and the fear of war. So artistic estrangement can make one's wife more lovable and the fear of war more real. Estrangement is what makes art artistic, but by the same token, it makes life more lively or worth living. And I already suggested that what interests me are not specific stylistic elements of estrangement, but rather how it becomes a certain kind of practice, existential practice, and later political practice. So I argue that in the case of Shklovsky, it was not a linguistic turn, not a structuralist turn, but rather kind of a parabolic and poetic turn. It's interesting, this line of thinking did not lead to structuralist theory and is less known in the West, so perhaps suggests a different history. So the important thing with Shklovsky's understanding of estrangement is that it's different from both Hegelian and Marxist notion of alienation. Artistic estrangement is not to be cured by incorporation, synthesis, or belonging. In contrast to the Marxist notion of freedom, which consists crudely in overcoming alienation, Shklovsky estrangement is in itself a form of limited freedom, endangered by all kinds of modern teleologies and utopian visions of the future. And I also argued in detail how this estrangement led to his concern with the preservation of public sphere in the post-revolutionary Russia. So you might be thinking, what's Jewish about all of this? So I will try to answer this question with more questions and remind you. Shklovsky wrote a very funny thing. He said that in the Soviet Russia, everything is so contradictory that we became witty in spite of ourselves. And he also wrote, his was very witty, the other my favorite witticism, which shows you transformation of estrangement as a static category to estrangement as political and ethical category. He writes, paraphrasing Marx again, saying, yes, we all know that social being determines consciousness, but now I mix the same word, conscience, but consciousness, but conscience remains unsettled. And this gap between consciousness and conscience and the unsettled conscience is where estrangement becomes more than an aesthetic practice. So Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg made an interesting comment that all his life he was fascinated by distance, that for him was the most pronounced feature of Jewish perspective. Figures of estrangement, we all know, are abundant in the works of German, East European, and Russian Jewish writers, Georg Zimmel's Stranger and Adventurer, Walter Benjamin's Flaneur and Collector, Victor Shklovsky's Strange Man from Strange Country, Hannah Arendt's Pariah, Girl from Abroad, and Self-Conscious Pariah. In her essays of 1944, Hannah Arendt reflected on the pariah's and stranger's capacity for independent thinking and self-distancing, but at the same time she raised the question that such contemplative freedom and the special intimacy of the pariah community might come at the expense of engagement with the world, concern with political right, the right to have rights. So for me, this is a very important axis at what point estrangement from the world can become what I would call estrangement for the world. So I wanted to trace this evolution, briefly speaking about Shklovsky's participation in these campaigns in the East, and where he develops this notion of vernacular cosmopolitanism, not looking at Europe, but actually looking at Ottoman Empire, Persia, and the kind of Russian behavior there. So I actually don't know, you know that in the Soviet Union, national identity was fifth line in the passport. So I have no idea what was written in Shklovsky's passport. So for those of you who want to be technical, his father was a Jew, his mother was a German Latvian. Shklovsky received no formal Jewish education. And in his case, thinking in Jewish was not thinking in Yiddish. And yet, he constantly thinks through parables and biblical examples that very strongly suggest Jewish literacy and familiarity with certain modes of thinking. I would say a few words about this text called Sentimental Journey, which is written exactly right after these campaigns. It's an amazing multi-generic text, partially written during the war, that records a journey through the border zones of Russian Empire and Persia and the encounter with local Jews and other national minorities, which forces Shklovsky to reflect on revolutionary and nationalist violence. First of all, it's interesting that Shklovsky doesn't frame it as a journey to the exotic orient or to the land of the enemy. Rather unconventionally, for the soldier of the Russian army, he declares, I quote, "My orientation was local." So it's not Orientalism, but orientation. There was, continuing with Shklovsky's quote, "There was one feature in the East, Persia and Turkey in this case, that reconciled me to them." I quote, "There was no anti-Semitism here." Possibly it is the experience of the Russian army that made Shklovsky in fact identify himself with the Jews, because he writes that the officer told him, "You are a son of the Jew, therefore a Jew." So it's a very different conception of what Jew is. So when speaking of Russian army, Shklovsky talks about what he calls transensical anti-Semitism, using again the literary trope. We discuss political reality. I have to skip about talk more. When it comes to his Jewish identification and self-identification, it appears to be a comedy of errors on all fronts, so to speak. Shklovsky tells the story that when the British conquered Jerusalem, a strange delegation of the Assyrians came to visit Shklovsky carrying a gift of sugar and kishmish. Here is a quote. "Your people and my people would live together again. It is true we destroyed the Temple of Solomon a long time ago, but we also restored it," continued Shklovsky. They spoke that way because they considered themselves Assyrians and me a Jew. In fact, they were mistaken. I'm not quite a Jew, не совсем еврей. And they are not descendants of the Assyrians. They are Aramaic Jews. So the irony of this mutual misrecognition resides in the fact that both sides see the other as more Jewish. And yet this leads to a deep human connection. A little estrangement does not preclude empathy. Shklovsky becomes very interested in local national minorities. He even actually simulated the pogrom of the Russian army, which was supposed to take place, the pogrom of Kurds. So he tried to tell his officer the pogrom has already happened. So Shklovsky is really fascinated by Jewish heteroglossia and cultural plurality in general. He collects as much material as he can about languages, habits, and political situation of local minorities, Jews and non-Jews, Kurds, Armenian, Georgian Jews who speak Tatar dialect, Assyrians, Izors, Nestorians, and so on. And most importantly, he now defines himself as, quote, half Jew and a role player, and he tells us a series of parables. He talks about his relationship to the revolution, his relationship to Jewishness, through kind of modernist parables. And I would share with you one parable that interestingly anticipates the Derridian one. When he wants to talk about, again, this is all in the context of violence. For me, this parable redefines kind of Saussurean linguistics via passion. So Shklovsky tells a story from the Bible, I'm paraphrasing, how Jews pursue Philistines to the river and ask them to say Shabeles. They would say Sabeles, and they would be identified and killed. Then he writes, I quote, "I saw a Jewish boy in Ukraine. He couldn't look at porn without shaking. They told me the story. When they were murdering in Ukraine, they needed to know if they are murdering a Jew. So they would ask them, say kukuruza, and the Jew would say kukuruja, and they would kill him." So here the difference in one vowel, which is like a principle of phonetic binarism in Saussurean linguistics, becomes a parable of violence. So the marker of linguistic difference becomes a matter of life and death. It functions as a kind of test of circumcision, invoking Hebrew word for circumcision, which is word, and also kind of anticipating or creating alternative archaeology for Derridian shibboleth, which, as you know, is a discussion of post-Salam, and Derrida frequently talks about unreadability in Salam, and I discovered that frequently this unreadability is actually a reference to Osip Mandelstam, because Salam at that moment is translating Osip Mandelstam. That's yet another Jewish kind of comedy of errors and misrecognitions. So for me, it became very interesting, this need for parables. And it often involves the relation to violence. So this is for me also very interesting, that estrangement becomes a critique of the theory of necessary violence. Shklovsky says that he writes sentimental journeys through facts and corpses. He makes an appeal against violence. Citizens stop killing, men are no longer afraid of death. There are already customs and techniques for telling a wife about the death of her husband. It changes nothing. It makes everything harder. So violence is by no means excused or glorified as a part of the necessary revolutionary sacrifice for the sake of the future liberation of humanity. So nor are numerous descriptions of dismembered bodies presented as an example of modernist aesthetic of disfiguration or dehumanization of art, to paraphrase Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset. Instead, it's the courage of estrangement that helps to lay bare the dehumanization and violence of war. So I make a big argument that Shklovsky come to a certain version of humanism, not kind of a bourgeois humanism, but closer to Georg Simmel idea of mystery of individuality, protection of spontaneity, and non-instrumentalization of the human being. There was a famous quote, of course, for Stalin, it's you need to break eggs to make an omelet. In Russian, is there would be a lot of splinter, the timber of humanity, when you're cutting the forest. So this is an early critique of this kinds of metaphors. So I have to skip more on Shklovsky. He has to renounce formalism in 1930. He's accused in being a cosmopolitan and practicing a cosmopolitan discipline of comparative literature. He later, his theory is used during the trial of Sinyavsky and Daniel, and he writes about various eccentric Jews, like the Sephardic Jews who served in the court of Peter the Great, and also does research in the Caucasus on the Holocaust of the Jews, and so contributing to the Black Book of Eliade Burg. So the Jewish preoccupation continues in Shklovsky quite strongly. To skip, no? So had Hannah Arendt and Viktor Shklovsky crossed paths in Berlin or Marburg in 1920s, they might have discovered that in spite of differences in style, they share the art of estrangement. And I developed in detail kind of the role of distancing and estrangement in Arendtian theory, particularly looking not so much in human condition, but on her experiments in thinking, her essays. Too long? Okay, I have to run. So Arendt already knows something. So what's original in Arendt's conception is her departure from philosophical tradition in the very location of freedom, which she does not locate in the domain of will, in the inner citadel of human psyche, but rather in the public world. So I was very interested in the connection between Arendtian theory of freedom to the tradition of East European descent, but also the use of aesthetics, because Arendt compares experience of public freedom to performance, and it's very important that this is by no means a total work, but rather aesthetic practice, which is also characteristic for Shklovsky. He's very interested in using aesthetic practice for political purposes, but it's always a non-funnelizable practice. The same with his conception of Jewishness as a kind of more open identity. So with Hannah Arendt, I try to coin two terms, estrangement from the world and estrangement for the world. And to be brief, I connect this idea of estrangement for the world to Arendtian theory of judging and passionate thinking, which for me is very important. I'm developing this further, trying to identify how do you exercise judging? How does it work? What forms this thinking take? Also, I'm very interested in skip this idea of her idea of worldliness, which she discusses almost as a kind of dinner table, which becomes a framework that separates and unites. And this table is kind of uncanny, and I was interested in if somebody can help me with the whole Jewish tradition of olam and later tikkun olam, and I learned that olam actually meant something invisible and then becomes something material. So I'm kind of interested in all these concepts that we never thought of direct relationship to almost Maimonides, Mendelssohn, and other Jewish thinkers. And I try to also, in my search for alternative archaeology, I try to argue that perhaps if we start not so much with Marx's Jewish question, but with Arendtian reflection on Lessing and kind of between the lines on the dialogue between Mendelssohn and Kant, that offers kind of an alternative more, or we can go back to Montaigne, kind of thinking through non-finalizable dialects and genuine pluralities both within individual and in the world. But I'm skipping this part because I want to get to the fun part. To also understand and talk about fear, which would be more provocative part, and I will try to do it in 5 minutes. Okay? This is Hannah Arendt. Experience of freedom is something strange, so here we're going to also understand. Whoops. Okay, I didn't put it in the PowerPoint. All right. So Arendt, when Arendt talks about worldliness, she uses a quote from Mandelstam speaking about gratefulness for being. So it's not only a Heideggerian concept, but it has direct connection to this other tradition. And I worked quite a lot on Mandelstam and his very problematic relationship to Jewish belonging. And I discovered something, I think. Recently, thinking about this passionate thinking, I was always fascinated by Mandelstam's notion of fear. What are we to do with a Jewish fear? So I wanted to throw it in the next 5 minutes. So I give you a quote from the Egyptian stamp, which is kind of was autobiographical text and anti-autobiographical text, and it's from 1928. It was supposed to illustrate what Mandelstam calls the end of the novel, the idea that we can no longer write a novel based on individual biography. We have to engage with what he calls the noise of time, or this kind of spirit of modernity. So there is a quote. First in the translation. It is terrifying to think that our life is a tale without a plot or a hero, made of emptiness and glass, out of the feverish babble of constant digressions, out of the Petersburg influenza delirium. So it seems like quite a terrifying quote, but I discovered that this was the English translation. In Russian it is «Страшно подумать, что наша жизнь – это повесть, сделанная из пустоты и стекла». «Страшно» in Russian is not terror, is not the sublime awe. It has nothing to do with sublime. It's scary, or it's fearful. So I looked at this fear, the role of fear in Mandelstam, and it became quite interesting. It's actually have a very multi-layered discussion. It's a little bit hard to skip it, but I have to try. Basically, okay, the text works as a story. Okay, let me try. Noise of time. Yeah. So it's a story of what he calls kind of failed novelistic hero partner, that I call him like a lyrical hermaphrodite. He's neither quite male nor quite female. We don't know his nationality. In fact, in the novella, there are Germans, Egyptians, Greek, Czechs, but there are almost no Russians, Poles too. So he's a kind of this Chaplin-esque hero who is a failed hero partner who at the end becomes kind of a Don Quixote who tries to save the city from violence. That's one line of the plot. At the very end, when this quote comes, the narrator says, "Please don't conflate me with partner." And he proceeds to tell a story in the first person about personal fear. And fear is associated with childhood dream, which probably is a dream of pogrom or persecution. So then Mandelstam says, "Fear takes me by the hand and leads me, a white cotton glove, a woman's glove without fingers. I love fear, I respect fear. I almost said, with fear I have no fear. Mathematicians should build a tent for fear, for it is the coordinates of time and space. They participate in it like rolled up felt in the nomad tent of the Kyrgyz. Fear unharnesses the horses and when one has to drive and send us dreams with unnecessary low ceilings." So fear at the end of the novella is given time and space. And it's through this space of fear that the work of poetic judgment continues. Freud made very interesting observation distinguishing fear from anxiety. Fear actually has an object and actually mobilizes self-defense, a combination of reasonable fear and resistance. Overall fear might be paralyzing, but its absence can produce trauma and fright. So I try to argue this kind of confrontation with fear rather than terror enables judgment and allows an encounter with actual history. And then I argue, and I just suggested, that in the conversation about Dante, which is an amazing theoretical work, which also has not been sufficiently taken up and reflected upon, Mandelstam uses all those metaphors of fear, embarrassment, failure, discussing Dante, the leading figure of world culture. And he tries to imagine this kind of worldliness of the Mediterranean 40 years before Brodel, suggesting this kind of alternative notion of cosmopolitanism where Dante becomes very close to the sort of figure of self-reflective Jew. I have to skip really, really a lot. So do I just move to conclusion?
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. And so all the lateral moves are lost, but I wanted to conclude and maybe show you a good image that I wanted to identify in broad strokes this paradoxical hyphenated Jewish sensibility. Unlike Jacobson, they do, so first of all, it's sometimes best described via negativa. First of all, unlike Jacobson, they did not embrace the binary system of thinking and define political theology and teleology. They look for the third ways, lateral moves, everyday genres in literature and life. In other words, they explored what Arendt calls worldliness and looked for the kind of different definitions of world culture that would be very much informed by the Jewish tradition. And I was looking for this kind of humanism in a minor key through the introduction of human scale and resistance to instrumentalization of violence. It operates through the estrangement of cruelty, non-instrumentalization of the human being, for grounding of embarrassment and human error that resists any kind of revolutionary teleology and that justifies violence. So let me just, in 1 second, show an image to leave you with the image. This is a project I did called Touching Writing, which was used for the PMLA issue on the Derrida. It was my own morning ritual. I touched one fallen page from Derrida, and I wanted to leave you with an image that kind of reflects on the theme of the conference. And this was a project, I was very inspired by a Arendian quote that we have at the end of her essay on freedom, that again referring to the end of history, that we have to estrange the imminence of disaster to look for what she calls unforeseeable and unpredictable. For the more heavily the scales are weighted in favor of the disaster, the more miraculous will the deed done in freedom appear. For it is disaster, not salvation, that always happens automatically and therefore must appear irresistible. So this is my comment, which is just 16 seconds. I was fascinated with the whole figure of black square. So instead of using the image of Malevich, I used photographs of erased or murdered, in this case, Jewish Trotskyists from Latvia. And the erasures have this uncanny look of black square, which gives us a different version of the abstraction. So this is touching the page of history, so I kind of do this phantasmagoric ritual of touching and turning the page of history, commemorating the erasures. So it's a kind of memory of multiple historical spirits of what Arendt calls dignity of the defeated, rather than the Geist of history with a capital G. So I have to rush. Thank you very much.
So, Svetlana and Martin decided that they would take questions immediately after their talks. We have time for a few questions, probably 10 minutes.
Svetlana, thank you very much. Among many threads, among many possible threads, I'm wondering what you might have to say about the juxtaposition of Shklovsky's responses to Jews and to the landscape and to the other peoples in his military experiences to Babel's.
Well, this is very interesting because there is a great difference between what Babel wrote in the main text and what he wrote in his diaries. And I'm really a great believer that we have to think between the texts, not between the lines. So in his diaries, well, first of all, I think there is a similarity. Babel is also extremely sympathetic to many people, both Poles, Czechs, and Jews, but in the diaries, he actually does not, there is no glamorization of Cossacks and no glamorization of violence. But I do not believe that Red Cavalry has glamorization of violence, but there is has a certain perverse fascination for this masculine figure.
His long leather.
Yeah, like almost like homoerotic Cossack, right? Which I believe in Israel they were also interesting in this tradition. And now that Cossacks walk on the street of Petersburg, I usually cross the street when I see them. But in Babel's diaries, we do not find it. So I think the differences, the similarities is the fascination for kind of cultural landscape of cultural diversity and the kind of empathy to basically anybody non-Russian, to Russians too. in this case. Difference is Shklovsky is much more clear-sighted. Shklovsky actually wrote about Babel quite a lot. I think Shklovsky is much more clear-sighted. Shklovsky never was the Bolshevik propagandist in the way Babel was. Shklovsky is perhaps less Nietzschean than Babel was. In a way, he's more of an ironist. Babel was that as well. But I think if you read together Babel's diaries with the Red Cavalry, the text, the official text and unofficial text, you will find something similar.
What do you think Shklovsky would have made of this famous quote attributed to Samuel Goldwyn, "Include me out"? I think that follows his line of thinking, and one of the reasons why estrangement becomes such a realistic position is that you're estranged when you can't belong, and since nobody is really on your side, you can't be really on anybody's side.
But actually, I argue that this is not quite the practice of Shklovsky and estrangement. He was very interested in dialogues, communities. He wrote about social contract, public sphere. This is almost, for me, like a suppressed left tradition, which we know very little about. And it was very interesting to discover that in a way we assume that estrangement, Carlo Ginzburg again, and misrecognition wrote about it as inner freedom. And I think it was a very different practice. It was kind of a practice of alternative communities that was later taken up by dissidents in the 60s and 70s. So it was not an extremely individualist practice. So when Shklovsky finds himself in exile in Berlin, he's completely lost. He loses his estrangement because he doesn't have a community. So it's not, do not think that all estrangement is, don't think that estrangement is estrangement is estrangement.
In the center.
In line with this, estrangement is estrangement, or it's not estrangement, it's not estrangement, it's not estrangement. What is the relationship between estrangement and defamiliarization?
It's the same word, two translations.
Oh, in which case I'm very curious about what were the agendas of the translators to what struck me as two very different
Okay,
notions.
so the Russian word is, and I discussed it in great detail in the book. So the Russian word is neologism, or stranение, which is closest would be dépaysement. It has the root stran, which is country, which is actually very important because Shklovsky writes about Soviet Russia, what a strange country. So he really has this connection to the country. So it was in translation. The Russian word actually has the kind of common root with strangest and stranness. So defamiliarization is fine, but it's translation of the same term. And at the end of his life, Shklovsky writes that it was misinterpreted as form versus content, and that was never his idea, that he understood it as surprise and wonder vis-a-vis the world. So that's again this kind of worldliness that for me is important. So for me, this would be more tradition of dissent and unconventional thinkers. I don't even know how to connect it to contemporary moment. Forgot to mention that Mandelstam, actually, while Mayakovsky committed suicide in 1930, Mandelstam wrote the epigram to Stalin and was the only writer who did it. So this is where I was very interested how seemingly a political writer who writes, however, a lot about civic consciousness and this on the zigzag is the one who actually speaks up and writes an epigram. So this is what I meant, that this particular thinkers exercise judgment, not always correctly, but they didn't fall into kind of party line thinking of any kind. But we're generally on the left in the case of Shklovsky.
We have time for one more question, and Sergei Kolopolsky has the microphone.
Thank you. This question was already prepared with a reference to strana, country, and Estrangement, and also because you mentioned Mandelstam. Here's a line from Mandelstam which will allow me to formulate the question. First in Russian, and I'll try to translate. Мы живем под собой ничьей страны. Наши мысли 10 шагов не слышны. We live without being able to feel our country under us. That's of course a very poor translation, but the other possibility.
The beginning of the epigram.
Right. So yes, and that takes me to the question as well, that the context is Stalin. So we leave being without feeling the strana, the country under us. So in that sense, we are estranged from the country. It's a very complex semiotic game between Estrangement, which is going away, but at the same time creation of a country. So to go away.
They did not want to be outside. That's what's interesting. They actually thought that they're the carriers of certain kind of civic consciousness. So that's the interesting thing. Yeah.
Yes, that takes me to the question, what you've already begun answering, I think. What do you think about, how would you comment about the political existence in the Soviet political setting that either Mandelstam or Shklovsky both engage, or perhaps it's completely irrelevant in your thinking?
Huge question. They took different strategies. Mandelstam could not write an epigram, even though he was considered classical apolitical poet. He wrote a lot about civicness, which is not the same as politics understood from Marx's perspective. He wrote about Republican civic consciousness, which is interesting. His concern was enlightenment. So he writes this epigram, which he reads to 6 people, and somebody forms out of the 6 strands. Shklovsky takes a different strategy. His brother is arrested. He publicly renounces formalism, even though the other formalists said that they saw him as a kind of political writer who could have been a Decembrist in the 19th century. So they explicitly see him as a political writer, which is not how he's translated in the West, but he took a more bleak route. But he never betrayed anybody, and according to Nadezhda Mandelstam, who of course accused everybody in collaboration, she actually thought that Shklovsky's route continued to be, not violating certain boundaries. And then both Shklovsky and Arendt signed this petition for the arrested writers in the 70s. So they took very different strategies, I guess. But neither of the strategies was like one was brave and almost heroic, and the other. It would take me a really long time to give you more subtle details that I really needed. And the other question is, how does it relate to Jewishness? And that's another question, because they become very interested in Jewishness very explicitly. Nadezhda Mandelstam reads some Zionists in the 1950s. Mandelstam moved, just one line, and I promised to stop talking. He starts in his first autobiographical text, The Noise of Time. He talks of his brother, his father, who was Yiddish speaking, as tongue-tied, somebody who couldn't speak proper Russian. And Nadezhda Mandelstam said he knew 5 languages. It was multilinguistic consciousness and not tongue-tiedness. But later, Mandelstam kind of embraces this multilinguistic consciousness and very explicitly talks about this kind of all kinds of Jewish position. And so does Shklovsky, even though he's half Jew, which is very different from other writers of the Jewish descent, like Pasternak. But I have so much to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Svetlana. Svetlana is followed by Martin Land. Martin Land is a theoretical physicist at Hadassah College in Jerusalem. He specializes in the problem of time. He is president of the International Association for Relativistic Dynamics. As his day job, he teaches computer science at Hadassah College in Jerusalem. He's been collaborating with Jonathan Boyarin since 1974. Please join me in welcoming Martin Land.
When I informed my department that I would be speaking here today, I was asked what sort of contribution a computer scientist could possibly make to a conference in Jewish studies. The question struck me as odd because I don't think of myself as a computer scientist. I am a physicist, after all. I mention this because the question suggests a reenactment of certain misapprehensions facing Jewish intellectuals entering the post-Enlightenment European Academy. Physicists come from the other side of campus and lack formal socialization into the traditions of Jewish studies and critical theory. Moreover, I bring the baggage of a very old but quite different heritage of critical thinking. Consequently, my grasp of the language of the humanities tends toward the semantic, rather than flowing organically from the idiosyncratic meanings that naturally evolve within a community of practice. So in some sense, I speak from the margins, and have reason to be concerned that the foreignness of my approach may color it as intrusively critical, or even stereotypically pushy. The theme of marginality in explaining the disproportionate representation of Jewish intellectuals in the discourse of European and American theory has been around for so long that I was surprised to learn that sociologists located its genesis in a 1919 paper entitled "The Intellectual Preeminence of Jews in Modern Europe" by Thorstein Veblen. Veblen's paper sits at the intersection of two questions posed by the organizers: the figure of the Jew, both as practitioner of critical theory and as its subject matter. Veblen's discussion is organized as a critique of Zionism, which he attributes to the Jews' well-known, quote, spirit of stubborn clannishness, unquote, and it expresses doubt that this isolation and inbreeding will bring great results. In Veblen's view, modern Jewish creativity is a product of participation in Europe. He writes, "This intellectual preeminence of the Jews has come into bearing within the Gentile community. The men who have been its bearers have been immersed in this Gentile culture, not proselyters of enlightenment with a formula worked out in the ghetto and carried into the Gentile community for its mental regeneration." He continues, "Only when the gifted Jew escapes the cultural environment created by the particular genius of his own people and falls into the alien lines of Gentile inquiry to become a naturalized, though hyphenate, citizen in the Gentile Republic of Learning, then he comes into his own as a creative leader in the world's intellectual enterprise." So in other words, naturalization brings more than citizenship. He writes, "The young gifted Jew with a taste for knowledge will unavoidably go into that domain of learning where Gentile interests dominate and Gentile orientation gives the outcome. There is nowhere else to go on this quest. He comes to realize that the traditions handed down within its own people have only such force as belongs to matters of habit." So finally, the inexorable logic of the dialectic exposes itself, and he writes, "The young Jew finds his own heritage untenable, but this does not mean that he will assimilate the traditions which the Gentile world has to offer. He does not uncritically take over their intellectual prepossessions. In short, he is a skeptic by force of circumstances over which he has no control." So I guess you could say that, stripped of every trace of national character, law, morality, religion, and so many bourgeois prejudices, a critical theorist rises from the ashes. This account, of course, is not precisely congruent with the experience of difference for the hyphenate citizen, compelled to negotiate through the similar cultural worlds. I can trace my own position as a critical theorist, at least as far back as age 5, suffering the minor indignity of being forced by my kindergarten teacher to sit on Santa's lap and tell him what I wanted for Christmas. Hearing the other boys, I quickly learned that I must ask for a gun. Clearly, Veblen's focus on Jewish preeminence ignores persecution as another possible source for Jewish criticism of European society. In particular, his shift of intention from exclusion to clannishness suggests a certain anxiety at directly confronting the newly naturalized citizen, associated with what psychoanalyst Melanie Klein called projective identification. Freud described projection as a defense mechanism in which we refuse to acknowledge some feelings we find objectionable in ourselves and ascribe the feelings to another person. Klein observed that in some cases, this other person introjects the projection, that is, comes to identify with the feelings we project, and experience them as her own. In particular, Klein theorized that an infant, unable to control his mother, projects his anger onto her, regarding his mother as hostile to him. In the symmetry of this relationship, the nurturing mother accepts the projected anger, safely containing it for the infant until the infant is mature enough to acknowledge it. Perhaps Veblen's Gentiles, unable to contain their own displeasure, either toward Jews or possibly toward Europe itself, projected it onto the Jewish intellectual, who symmetrically accepted the role of critic. Ironically, it would then have been easier for Europe to accept Jews as critics of European culture than as fawning assimilationists. Whatever the explanation for a Jewish critical outlook, be it a general experience of difference, the method of yeshiva learning, the ethical mitzvahs, the prophetic tradition, or something else, I find it useful to identify with our noted tendency to answer questions with questions. And why shouldn't I? It may surprise us as academics, but not everybody likes questions. And deprecation of criticism and skepticism are correlated, if not identical, to another issue raised in this conference, resistance to theory. The accessibility of any theory can be difficult to maintain under changing circumstances. It is a general frustration of aging that fewer people share direct experience, that as fewer people share direct experience with the material reference of our discourse, we may suffer a loss of attunement and recognition when they regard the signified and the signifier as no less abstract from one another. But I am personally in no position to comment on the end of theory as an issue in career management. I'm also going to ignore the use of rhetorical hyperbole in relation to the routine modification of established theory. Just as faster-than-light neutrinos cannot prove that Einstein was wrong, so successive enhancements to critique do not threaten its collapse. I am concerned with a more general hostility to the program of theory, a hostility that has become pernicious in the 21st century, seamlessly integrating assertion of hegemony from above with a creepy receptivity from below. One popular explanation for resistance to theory is subsumed in assorted declarations of the death of irony. According to this narrative, we have entered a period of heightened insecurity as our social, political, economic, technological, and physical environments become frighteningly complex. As a result, we require an age of sincerity in which ideas are judged primarily by their effectiveness in preserving our sense of safety, diverting attention from the real complexity and its attendant risks. The desire to shield comforting certainties against challenge and criticism can easily become an antagonism to the questioning viewpoint and resistance to theory. Whether or not one identifies a guiding hand in the latest capitalism and the newest world order, its complexity is inherently alarming. A fundamental lesson of systems theory, from robotics to resistance to empire, is that complex systems often become unpredictable and uncontrollable. The emotional problem, as understood by Klein, is that lack of control causes frustration, typically inducing fear and rage, which in turn may be projected onto others. Complex systems are not just complicated. For example, the weather system is described by just 7 concise and deterministic equations. But taken together, those equations describe a nonlinear dynamics whose solutions include unstable and chaotic behavior. From this we learn that extreme weather conditions are all too likely and that long-term prediction is very difficult, the so-called butterfly effect. In confronting this situation, we can either emulate Klein's mature mother, accepting the existential fact of complexity in nature and preparing for extreme climate scenarios, or we can emulate her frustrated infant by projecting freak storms onto gay marriage. The infantile approach resists theory by displacing it with a pseudo-theory, formulated in a rhetoric of oversimplification, common in business and politics, and also lately infecting parts of academia, including computer science. Oversimplification can be cute, as when children over-regularize grammar saying, I goed instead of I went. That makes perfect sense. But when Einstein said that theory should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, his point is that oversimplification replaces explanatory power with a muddle of superficial newspeak. Much oversimplification is self-consciously instigated by power elites completely aware of their plans and intentions and material self-interests. As Orwell wrote, the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought. In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. So some of the specific techniques today include the power of the phrase national security to disrupt systematic thought and launch a stampede into a schizoid underworld of for us and against us. Also, the use of axiomatic syllogism, such as claiming that because the free market solves all problems, poverty and inequality cannot be problems. Another is the application of rules outside their proper domain, as in claiming that the land of Israel legally belongs uniquely and unequivocally to the children of Israel. Heard the word Israel twice in the same sentence? It must make sense to me. These examples are not merely bad reasoning. They valorize oversimplification as a method of reasoning whose rules can be summarized as follows. Address every problem by reduction to a single unitizing explanation, while simultaneously resisting engagement with any carefully constructed and coherent theory, blurring important distinctions, and avoiding any serious consideration of complexity or its causes, remaining indifferent to self-contradiction and confounding evidence, responding to criticism by accusing critics of having aggressively initiated the problem itself just by having raised the question. But why, again, should any of this be convincing? I return to the confrontation with complexity and suggest that this rhetoric of oversimplification dovetails with certain emotional defenses we deploy against fear of the present. For example, the notion that historical development could somehow end, that capitalism has reached an ideal homeostasis, and that theory will no longer be necessary to understand or influence our experience, clearly serves those who benefit from current trends in this system. But it may also provide, in the form of self-delusion, some comfort against a generalized xenophobia felt by some who feel themselves disappearing into an entirely foreign present, populated by unfamiliar peoples, technologies, and political economic arrangements. Wilfred Bion, a psychoanalytic follower of Klein and Freud, studied the construction of delusion and psychosis, and his work is useful in understanding the appeal of oversimplification. Unlike Freud, Bion did not understand psychosis as withdrawal from the reality principle, but rather as a form of disrupted perception with the detailed and specific goal of protecting the mind from painful knowledge. Bion argues that whatever the cause or meaning of psychosis, delusion should not be understood as its goal, but rather as its methodology, and understood epistemologically. Therefore, his observations are not limited to psychosis, and are applicable to a much wider class of phenomena involving disrupted knowing. In particular, his conclusions provide a systematic account of the simplistic method. For Freud, the reality principle meant consciousness of sense impressions, followed by attention, memory, judgment, and thought. Thought, he believed, begins as unconscious relations among object impressions, which become, quote, perceptible to consciousness only through its connection with the memory traces of words. For Bion, these relations and connections, which he calls links, are not constructed in an automatic or straightforward manner, but are subject to complex inner dynamics. Knowledge is not just an impression stored in our brain, but first and foremost, a willingness to acknowledge a link between ourselves and, to acknowledge a link between objects, and thus enter into an emotional relationship between ourselves and the observed link. One might say that knowing is an offer of hospitality to a matrix of links we feel among object impressions. Or, also echoing Svetlana's talk, it's a willingness to engage with fear and to not panic when we feel fear. Putting this into Kleinian language, Bion writes, thought depends on a capacity for balanced introjection and projection of objects and a fortiori an awareness of them. That is, to think is to willingly internalize perceived links among external objects, making them part of our inner world, and to externalize internal links, seeing correspondence between our inner recognition of the world and the objects among us. So where Freud sees psychosis as disengagement from objects, Bion sees engagement, but with a disorganized awareness of the links between the objects. Bion writes, knowledge is not a thing we have, but a link between ourselves and what we know. The opposite is not just ignorance, but the active avoidance of knowledge, or even the wish to destroy the capacity for it, leading to hatred of emotion, hatred of reality, and hatred of life itself. Maximum severance from reality, from greatest economy of effort, is achieved by launching destructive attacks on the link that connects impressions and consciousness. The deployment of projective identification would be particularly severe against the relations between object impressions, for if this link could be severed, then at least consciousness of reality would be destroyed, even though reality itself could not be, unquote. In other words, the strategy is to attack the messenger, raging at our own senses until they introject the projection that is comply by delivering delusional perceptions. Bion's papers get fairly technical, involving a number of Kleinian abstractions. My interest is in the way in which Bion's analysis of disrupted knowing, when applied in the context of mundane, everyday self-delusion, can account for the rhetoric of oversimplification and resistance to theory. Bion described four major consequences of the attack on linking. Integration. Bion argues that attacking the links between objects and the sublinks within complex objects subverts the development of an integrated personality. The explanation here involves Kleinian abstractions that I don't have time to get into, but he makes it quite convincing. This, in turn, harms the ability to develop a holistic picture of the world. Space, time, relationships all appear split, disjointed, episodic, asynchronous, fragmented, chaotic, and schizoid. Nothing in experience is amenable to theory, and all explanations are by nature ad hoc. With no integrated self, I am in no danger of contradicting myself. Articulation. Bion emphasizes that the attack on links impairs the capacity to articulate and synthesize. The mind can fuse impressions into a jumble of slogans, but not a coherent program. Useful distinctions are blurred, important categories are rearranged to defy rather than enhance comprehension. Problem resolution. Freud saw psychoanalysis as archaeology, uncovering, reframing, deconstructing, and resolving. For Bion, the attack on curiosity and learning produces a delusion with an infinitely adaptive capacity for regeneration. He writes, "We are confronted not with a static situation that permits leisurely study, but with a catastrophe that remains at one and the same moment, actively vital and yet incapable of resolution." Criticism is always co-opted and redeployed to advance the overall confusion. And finally, paranoia. Bion argues that the attack on linking necessarily subverts the grasp of causation. Therefore, problems cannot be formulated in terms of causality, in terms of causes, let alone addressed or solved. He writes, "The patient appears to have no problems except those posed by the existence of analyst and patient." This position rejects theorizing as if the very act of posing questions were the cause of all the frank complexities. The problem with the climate is the climate scientists. The problem in the Middle East is anti-Semites who want to delegitimize the state of Israel. So why is this bad for the Jews? I said earlier, with no small degree of oversimplification, that the Jewish critical orientation can be associated with the habit of answering questions with questions. I would like to believe that the habit reveals an absence of discomfort with posing questions and expressing skepticism. It said of the Talmud that the student cannot understand it without bringing a willingness to challenge its correctness. And it's not surprising that even the New York Times applies the adjective Talmudic as a pejorative for intricate reasoning based on subtle distinctions. Following Bion's view that knowledge is a willingness to acknowledge a link and to enter into an emotional relationship between ourselves and the link, questioning is then a further willingness to bring that relationship into the intersubjective space. The habit of persistently raising questions thus relies on two important conditions. We must feel free to pose questions without concern that this will either threaten whatever basic security we derive from long-standing beliefs, or threaten our social and intellectual relations with others. Opposing this, the attack on linking and the resistance to theory are designed to enforce loyalty to a simplistic description of the world into which Jews, among many other voices now heard in Europe and America, are the proverbial square pegs confronting round holes. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. We have 15 minutes for questions from Martin.
An abstract question. What would you say to the very notion of limits of complexity and abstraction in language, and that limits on the expressive capacity of language to address issues are intrinsic, have to be accommodated in modeling the world? Or
well, when I get up in the morning, the first thing that I remember is Gödel's incompleteness theorem that tells us that whenever we choose a starting place in any discussion, we do violence to the holistic nature of that discussion, and there will always be either contradictions or truths that we cannot discover. In other words, the world is highly nonlinear, and the way that we generally proceed in understanding problems is by creating a linear approximation to that system, which we can work with and play with, and we move things over here, and consequences will be slightly different. But that's only part of the story. Globally, when we put it all back together, we know that we're constantly in need of reevaluating and repositioning ourselves. There are things that we can say here and will be true that once we move to a different place to stand, those things are no longer precisely true, and we need to rephrase them and we need to rethink them. So that is how I understand the use of language. Language, in my view, in Gödel's view, is one possible way in which we create a linear approximation to the inherent complexity in the world.
You want to follow up? Another question?
I guess I want to push the use of psychoanalysis,
or perhaps to maybe trouble it a little bit. I'm tempted to defend Freud a little bit here, but I'll put that aside. What I really want to ask about is the use of a kind of analogy that links the experience of post-modernity, whatever you want to call it, to say Klein or Freud or what have you. And it strikes me that you allow for complexity on one side of the equation, but not sufficiently on the other. In other words, you produce an analogy based on an individual state of affairs or a particular psyche, but isn't the problem in some ways a matter of what Freud would call group psychology? I mean, isn't the complexity really about, and especially when we're thinking about, say, the way that things are dumbed down, etc., isn't it a matter more of the relations between so many psychologies that can reinforce a particular way of thinking? And I'm thinking in particular about the strangeness of the fact that Freud's group psychology comes from that kind of horrific Le Bon book about, you know, race in Europe in particular, so that there seems to be a real intimate link between not just one psychology, but many psychologies, and which is a complex system which thereby produces simplification.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I think that if I had continued writing this, it would have been necessary for me to really answer the question that I posed for myself. What is the threat to my feeling safe to pose questions? And it's not just my own fear of recognizing what's out there, so to speak. But part of what's out there is also not simply demands for loyalty, but, as you say, a group psychology that demands loyalty implicitly. So yes, I agree with you.
I'll follow up slightly. Would you think that the Jewish psyche, lack of a better word, is more amenable to waking up with Gödel, Einstein, and complete?
It's hard. I don't know whether it's Jewish, but I spent the last 2.5 years as part of one of my jobs teaching in a college for ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students, teaching them computer science. And one of the things that I was amazed by for these students was that if you can formulate a question, it's a legitimate question. The moment you can pose it in a sensible way, it's a question that needs to be discussed. And there's reason to do that. And that was the world that I grew up in, not in an Orthodox yeshiva, but that was the mindset that I grew up with. And I guess that was my Jewish tradition. And so, as in almost all Jewish traditions, I tend to extend it out and imagine that that's what it was.
My question is more about not the who or the why of question, or I guess the how of questioning, but the when. Because it seems to me there's a fundamental issue about when is a question appropriate and when is it not appropriate. And this is actually something that I think I certainly struggle with it when me asking a question is disabling of critical action. When it doesn't just throw me out of the group who's already made a decision or doesn't want to ask the question, but at some point I can formulate the questions all day, but I also have to act. So yeah.
I understand the question that you're raising, and all I can say is that historically in my life, I've been pretty terrible at knowing when to shut up. And especially poorly formulated criticisms coming from the political side that I stand on. Last night, Saylor referred to throwing out the word fascist for anything that we don't like, and I remember Lenny Bruce in the early 60s saying, "What do you mean fascist? I'm the mailman. That's why I'm wearing this blue uniform." And yes, I object to that, and many people object to my objecting to it. So I'm not the right person to ask that question. I've never been very good at making that distinction.
Would you speculate a bit about the relation between socialization and the fostering of the ability to live with the degree of fear that allows one to keep asking questions, perhaps even in a time when it's socially awkward? I mean, even early childhood and familial, and ego formation. I mean, does a strong ego allow itself to continue asking these questions?
Yes. Also, being oblivious helps. But there are other moments. It's said that there was a movie made in the 40s with Humphrey Bogart in which he was being tortured. And he said, "My goal is to make you he says to the torturer, "My goal is to make you as angry as possible and keep you as frustrated as possible without you killing me." And I learned that there is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder in which the person simply stops being afraid of negative consequences and tends to see themselves as somebody who can't be harmed anymore. And I think I suffer a bit of that. So that's part of my answer.
Question here in the front row.
This is prompted partially by what Jonathan was suggesting. I don't know Vion, but I'm really quite struck by this formula. Knowing is an offer of hospitality for certain links. This is an ethical as well as a cognitive and a psychoanalytical vision. And what's really beautiful about this formula, and I have to think more about it, is the way in which it bridges the ethical and the cognitive. Because, to offer hospitality, I mean, the question here is it is a gesture or it's certain receptivity, openness. And I'm wondering if you have thought of Adorno. Adorno seems to be somewhere in the background, but the closest that I can approximate to this in the critical theory tradition is, with Adorno's negative dialectics, where this idea of the recollection of the Andenken der Natur, this recollection of nature within us, this recollection that he also fully understands in the psychoanalytic sense of a kind of archaeological, digging into self. I mean, this is a very, very profound theory, strand also of the modern Jewish intellectual. I mean, it's amazing that maybe we all fell a little tight because I was going down the path of memory, but psychoanalysis was always, it was referred to as the talking cure, the Jewish cure, and it's just so much there. But anyway, so just some thoughts about the way in which this brings together the cognitive and the ethical, and about how maybe Adorno's thinking may or may not be here. And even if it is not, it's the same kind of attempt to sort of to view thinking and knowledge not just as the manipulation or devouring of the object, but also as a process of receptivity and going back into oneself. It's very suggestive. Thank you.
I first, I had read about the use of the term of hospitality as an ethical question many times, but I didn't really take it seriously until I heard Christiva talking about her own experience as being taken in as a refugee in France. And the sense of what hospitality meant to her on a personal level. And Bion doesn't use the word hospitality, but as soon as I read his description, it was the word that jumped out at me.
That's your term, not
his. I wouldn't say that I put the idea there, but I think that I made the connection between that word and that entire discourse and what he was trying to do.
We have time for one more question, and the microphone is in the center.
I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit more of the story of the 6-year-old on Santa's lap. There are many lovely stories embedded in the talk. I'm led back to that partly because Jonathan's question put us back in the realm of the young child, partly because the question of group psychology seems to be at work there. You were being socialized to say guns rather than ask a question, and partly because from Santa's point of view, he was offering hospitality on his lap, but that does not seem to be the hospitality you're talking about.
Right. Yes, for me it was clear that I was being forced to do something that I had been on some level or another warned at home not to do. There was a clash of socializations going on. That was probably the first time I became explicitly aware of the idea of having to understand two worlds. When I came home and told my parents about this, my mother was not at all surprised that my kindergarten teacher, Miss Schmeling, did not understand what my problem was. But yeah, there was just a flood of different messages coming in from all sides of it.
We do have a minute if you want to ask your one.
I'm just so curious about this experience, so I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Did you have any sense that you would get the thing you would ask? That he had some magical power at this stage in your life?
No, I would also say that at the age of 5 or 6, seeing myself as a big boy, the last thing I wanted to do was to sit on the lap of an old man who was chuckling. And the entire preconception that made that experience seem okay to all those other kids was missing for me. To me, this was just a very bizarre experience.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Svetlana and Martin.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.